For those of you that don't know me, I started my scientific career in this very room 30 years ago with Mass 1, and I was so fascinated with it that I was one of the people that threw those paper planes, and I'm glad to see that they've survived 30 years. But seriously, so I dropped Maths 1 and went over to the Benham building and started Botany 1, and that was the beginning of where I am now, I suppose. So in 2004, I started my own business, Kerri Muller NRM. I may need to look at a name change with our new minister, but we'll keep going with that for now. So what I've thought about a lot over the last little while is that I see natural resource managers in the Anthropocene as ecological engineers, as you can see from the title of my talk. I think we are working with novel ecosystems. I'm not the only one that thinks this, obviously. There's a lot of literature on novel ecosystems. So we're working with novel ecosystems, but we're also actively engineering them. So you could see NRM plans and all the other environmental management plans that are out there as blueprints for our future South Australian landscapes. Obviously, it's not just those plans that are in process, though. Social and our economic behaviours are also engineering our ecosystems. So we end up with some fairly perverse outcomes. So I think we've probably heard a fair bit about water reform in the Murray-Darling Basin. If you look at that, I was on the Living Murray Community Reference Group in 2004 when we first started talking about water reform. We, the environmentalists, all 5 of us out of the 35 on that panel, all said, concrete does not equal water. We need water. If we're going to buy back water, we want to buy water. We don't want to buy infrastructure. That's not how it's panned out, obviously, and we've bought a lot of infrastructure with the money that was meant to be there for water. I was actually an advocate of compulsory acquisition, but that got shot down very quickly. So we are engineers. We're working in 3 different sorts of systems, really. And sorry, I'll get my next slide up. We have got the pre-European native vegetation dominated systems that have come across with us from the Holocene. But they are new, they are becoming newer as we move through the Anthropocene. So some of our traditional methods may or may not be relevant for managing those systems. We're also dealing with heavily modified ecosystems, Torrens Lake, for example, that are resistant to restoration. We can't take that back 200 years. It's also subject to competing needs. I'm working on a project at the moment on the Torrens Lake, and there are a lot of competing needs. Rowers need to be able to turn around. All these things that, as an ecologist, I have to try and fit into the structure of this little lake out here. We're also dealing with constructed ecosystems, ones that have been built specifically for delivery of ecosystem services. Constructed wetlands, for example, stormwater treatment, managed aquifer recharge, all those sorts of things. Green infrastructure. So we're engineering ecosystems, but I would argue that we don't have a common vision. And that's why we get into these perverse sort of outcomes where water buyback money ends up building concrete. We do, however, have a common cause. We are all animals. We are all dependent upon our ecosystems that we live within. We also share a lot of common values. Most people are actually good. Most people want to do the right thing. So we do have common values. We don't have a common vision. So I think our critical questions is not just what ecosystem is that you're working on, but also what ecosystem do you want? And how do we work together to engineer where we want to go? And how do we, as experts, those of us that consider ourselves to be experts, exert influence on what those ecological outcomes might be? And I suggest that we need a framework. Now, this is really, really obvious. It sort of seems a bit basic to have in a talk. But I'm going to give you some examples of how this works. So we start with vision and values. One of these is going to be a pointer. The middle one, thank you. So we start with vision and values. Whoops, sorry, I pressed another one as well. Now you've seen slightly ahead. But that's all right. So we start with a common vision and values that flows through to objectives and targets. We think about what options have we got to manage a certain system. We then hopefully are doing a good robust risk-benefit vulnerability type assessment. We determine whether there's any feasible options. We then try and work out if they're actually acceptable as well. If they're not, we need to think of new options. If they are, we go through to an action phase and we do something. We hopefully then monitor, I've gone right out of it now. Sorry, here we go, no. See, we used to use blackboards in my day. I could write it up here, that would be quicker. So hopefully we also do monitoring, evaluation, investigation, and actually close that adaptive management loop. Knowledge and experience feeds into all of those different parts of the framework. Engagement, education, reporting, all those sorts of things, communication, all feed into every part of that framework. And of course, we have lots of different things that we can use to fit into that framework. But what I'm arguing is we need to put these all together. So if we think about knowledge for a start, we consider ourselves experts and we understand these systems, sort of, and we think we know where we want to go. Obviously, there's other knowledge. Those of you probably didn't just see Billy because he was on in the Benham, but Billy was just talking about Western versus compared to Indigenous knowledge systems. So we know that there's a hell of a lot of Indigenous knowledge as well as our Western science. There's also a lot of knowledge from our landholders who are out there every single day. So it's bringing all that knowledge together, not just scientists. So when we think of how do we influence it through knowledge, but we're also all members of the community, so we're stakeholders as well. But I would argue that as experts, we have a role to set a vision for South Australia. What do we want this place to look like in 2100? We don't have a common vision for what that might look like. And I think that's why we get into these bizarre conversations that lead us down weird pathways, is because we don't all know where we're going. And if we know where we're going, all of this flows. It's not that hard. But I'd argue the vision and values is where we need to put our effort. So then we get a common understanding, we have collective action, we continuously improve what we're doing, we have resilient ecosystems and secure ecosystem services. It's worked for the Ford Motor Company since Henry Ford came up with this basic idea of risk management and systems and all that sort of stuff. ISO 14001 is where it sits in the international arena. How do you apply it? Very easy to apply to a small patch. Woo! Okay, sorry, I talked too much at the beginning. I always do that. Right, the Wright family, beyond development in Port Elliot. Tight family, really, really good vision. They wanted a sustainable development that people would enjoy living in. They knew how to do it, they had the money, they executed it, they went through the risk assessment, they got in experts, done an awesome job. They've turned a very crappy piece of salinised land into somewhere with these amazing wetlands, all constructed. They now have 100 bird species. They've also got threatened fish species that have been put in there by Aquasave. Nick Whiterod's mob have put threatened species in there that they got out of Lake Alexandrina during the Millennium Drought. Amazing. Look at roadsides, local councils. We've got all these different councils all trying to manage roadsides. Local councils, they want public safety. They want roads are for safe passage, that's it. Well, not quite. Some of them are very keen on conservation as well. Native Veg Council, who manages the Native Veg Act, says thou shalt not clear. And so we have this two different visions here. Is it a road? What values does a road have? How do we balance public safety clearance and native veg conservation? I've just been working on the Eyre Peninsula Roadside Veg Management Plan with 11 councils, and we've applied this model. We fall down with the vision, so we'll see how it goes. I just wanted to talk really quickly about the value of weeds on roadsides. Those of you that go through Mount Compass, I live in Victor Harbour, you go from Mount Compass to Victor Harbour, the apples go a certain way along the road, the blackberries go slightly further. Some of those apples, magnificent trees that are producing a huge amount of food for the community, have been killed because they happen to live next to a threatened species. I'm talking about something this wide that has 3 or 4 plants in it that are threatened. I would argue that there's a value to that apple tree. It connects people, there's a feeling of beauty, we know, we can look at climate change indicators as the blackberries shift away from Victor Harbour, and we see that constraint in where they can actually live. There's a whole lot of values to it. I'm not saying there wasn't a value to the 3 native plants that were there, but what's the hope that they're going to be there in 2100? The apple tree, maybe not it, but it will live for 70 odd years. The Kuraman Lakes I could talk about for 3 hours, but I know I've probably got 2 minutes or less, possibly. 2? All right, excellent. Its current biogeological formation, 7,000 years ago. We know the Ngarrindjeri people have been there for 30,000 or more since sea level rise. It's gone through so many ecosystem state transitions that, they're just phenomenal, even within my lifetime. I worked on the lakes during this period when we had the Millennium Drought and the lakes went to unprecedented low levels. We came within probably 3 or 4 months of the entire lake going to a pH of 4. We got lucky, it rained. So we got those rains that broke the drought up in New South Wales and Victoria. They came through and they filled the lakes. We had very little time to make a decision between, do we let these lakes acidify? Do we try and find some fresh water, which just wasn't going to happen. There was no water sharing framework that we could utilise. Or do we let the sea in and inundate with seawater and cover these acid sulphate soils with seawater? We did a massive vulnerability assessment. We had 56 different species. We looked at all their vulnerabilities, blah, blah, blah. And we concluded it was actually better to let it acidify than let in seawater, because we had a greater chance of being able to recover some of our freshwater species. If we let in seawater, we end up with a hypersaline system that doesn't even support estuarine species or freshwater or anything else. And some of the people in this room went on that journey with me, and we called it the ecological consequence assessment of letting in seawater, and we're just writing that up for the Royal Society of South Australia at the moment. But the reason I bring this up is I don't think we can restore some of these systems. The South Lagoon of the Coorong, as much as I hate to say it, is probably beyond restoration. We have to work out where we're going. So that's somewhere that we could start with a vision. It's a very depressing place to start, I must say. But what do we value? What are our feasible options for somewhere like the South Lagoon? What do we want? So I guess what I'm saying, and this is my last slide, so I'm almost on time, is in this post-truth Anthropocene, what I think this is exactly the right time for experts like us to be trying to drive this vision. I think with the collective knowledge that's at a conference like this, we as the NRM community should be driving a vision for what South Australia could look like in 2100 and build that knowledge and build that capacity so that we can actually get somewhere with some sort of common understanding of where we're going. Because I don't think we've got it, and I think without it, we're going to continue to come up with all these bizarre uses of limited resources and not the ecosystems that we actually really want. Thank you.